Hi, I'm Laura Nelkin. I'm a knitwear designer. I live in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region. And I have recently learned a new way to gauge swatch when I'm working in the round, and I'm super excited to share it with you. In this video, I'm going to go over why gauge swatching in the round is different than working a gauge swatch flat. Then I'll show you how I used to work my gauge swatches in the round and the new way that I have been pretty obsessed with the last few months. So we work gauge swatches for multiple reasons, but particularly when you are knitting a garment, you want to make sure your garment fits. So you need to make sure that you get the correct number of stitches and rows or rounds that your pattern calls for. The reason that working a gauge swatch for a project that is worked in the round is different than for working a project that is knit flat is that oftentimes our gauge is different when we knit and purl. So if you are working a sweater flat and seaming it, and the sweater is knit in stockinette stitch, that means you're going to knit your right side rows and purl your wrong side rows, and you would knit your swatch just like that. If you are working a sweater that is worked in the round, like bling tee that I am wearing, and it is worked in stockinette stitch for the body, that means you are going to be knitting every round. So it's pretty important that you work your gauge swatch in the round to make sure that you get the correct number of stitches and rounds so that your sweater fits you like you want it to. So I used to work my gauge swatch where I would end up with these long floats on the back of my work. And then if I didn't work them long enough, I would have to cut them before I went to block my swatch because they'd kind of hold the swatch in a little bit. And it used a lot of yarn that then you couldn't reclaim later, which kind of annoyed me. So I've learned this new way of working a gauge swatch and let me show you how to do that. Okay. So for this style of working a gauge swatch where I'm knitting every row, but I'm not working in the round for the swatch, you can see down on my needles right here that I just have these short little floats on one side. And I have worked across the row and my yarn is over here, but I don't want to have that long float on the back. So what I'm going to do is take my yarn and measure out like 3.5, maybe a tiny bit more lengths of the work on my needle. So I'm going to go 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then a little bit more, not quite 4, so that I've got this nice long strand right here. And then I'm going to bring that around so that the loop is to the inside and the working yarn is over here. And that way my working yarn is going to be on that end of my needle. And now I'm going to go and knit across all of those stitches on my needle. Now, the one thing I did not say about this technique is it is pretty important to work this on a circular needle or double pointed needles because you will be sliding your stitches to the other end of your needle. So that's an important difference if you're somebody who likes to work on straight needles, circular or double point. And now you can see I'm coming to the end right here of my gauge swatch. And I have just a little loop left there instead of that whole long strand. And now my working yarn is over here, so I'm going to slide my stitches to the other end of my needle, and then I can go ahead and knit across just like this. Now I'm going to chat with you about a few things while I knit to the end of this needle to show you that one more time. When you work a gauge swatch, you always want to cast on at least 5 inches or maybe even 6 inches. So if your pattern calls for 20 stitches over 4 inches, you should be casting on like 25 or 26 stitches. Don't cast on the exact number that your pattern calls for the gauge swatch. And that is because when you are done working your swatch and it is time to measure it, you are first going to block it and you're going to treat your swatch just like you would be treating your final sweater when you're done knitting it. And then you will grab your gauge ruler and you want to measure your gauge inside, away from the edges. You can see that your gauge is distorted. It's a little bit tight on this edge and it's a little bit loose on this edge. So you want to make sure to measure your gauge in from the edges and in from the edge on the top and the bottom. If you have any questions about this technique, please feel free to ask. I am happy to help and make anything more clear for you. I would love if you would subscribe to my channel, sign up for my newsletter, hit like on this video, and I look forward to sharing more knitting tips with you in the future. Thank you.